Hey guys, it's Carly. Today I wanted to share with you a few of my favorite tips and tricks for using layering stamp sets and a few of my recent cards with the Essentials by Ellen Summer Doodle set, which I am in love with. So first, let's talk about tools. The number one thing I would recommend is a stamping tool like the Misty because it makes matching up those layers so easy. I would also suggest starting with inks you're already comfortable with that you get good results on solid stamps. And if you need a little bit more help with that, I will link another article for you in the description below that will really help. And then the third thing is start with a set that's really cute, that's super easy to use, like the Essentials by Ellen Summer Doodles. So I've got the base layer of the sandcastle loaded up in my Misty, and I'm using Distress Oxide ink. Now, Distress Oxide ink isn't something I'd recommend for stamping unless you can do multiple impressions. So that's why the Misty is so great with this, because I can ink and stamp until I get the coverage that I'm looking for. Now next I want to stamp that top layer, the outline layer. So I'm going to grab my stamp and I'm going to line it up over the base image, close my Misty lid to pick it up. But before I commit to stamping it, I'm going to grab a piece of acetate that I keep in my Misty all the time. I'm going to put it over my project. That way I can ink up that outline layer and stamp it over my base layer and see if it matches up the way I want it to. If it does, I can just clean that acetate off and get it out of the way, ink up my stamp and stamp again. But if it doesn't, I have a chance to fix it before I stamp onto my project. And since it looked pretty good, I went ahead and got that acetate out of the way and stamped onto my project. Something else to note though is that I was using a dye ink to stamp over my Distress Oxide base, and I probably should have let my base dry a little bit longer to get a more crisp image of the outline. So either let the oxide dry or use the black oxide. To finish my little sandcastle, I gave it a few polka dot details with a tan alcohol ink marker and then with a white pen, and then I used it as a replacement for an A in a word die. I thought the Hooray from the Essentials by Ellen Winning Words and then the little Today's Forecast stamp set from the Essentials by Ellen Summer Sentiments just paired so well together, and I love how it turned out. Another great trick for using layering stamps, especially when you're going to be using multiples of the same image, is to create a little template. So I've die cut the flip-flops from a scrap of cardstock and I'm putting a little piece of low-tack tape on the back. Then I can pop that in my Misty and then take a bunch of the blank die cuts and pop them into the template one at a time, stamp the base layer. Having that template there is going to make it easier to line up the two layers of the stamp, and then it's also going to make it much quicker to do a whole bunch of the same image. And I'll show you another little trick that I like to use for all solid stamps, not just a layering one, but it's a little color blending kind of directly on your stamp. So first I'm inking up just the top half of those flip-flops, and then I'm using a blending tool to kind of soften any edges of the ink. And it doesn't have to be a blending tool if you don't have one handy. You could use your finger if you don't mind getting inky, or a mostly dry baby wipe, whatever you want to use. You just want to soften the edges of the ink so there aren't any harsh lines when you stamp. Now once you've finished your first color and you've got enough coverage that you want, you move on to your second color and just repeat the process. And actually I have found that I've had really good success with just using the blending tool to apply ink to my stamp in the first place and not even touching the ink pad to the stamp. So either way, you can get really fun effects like rainbow and like two-tone like I'm doing for these flip-flops. It's just really fun to experiment with. And after inking up a bunch of colorful flip-flops, I couldn't resist putting them into a grid pattern on a card. I think you can never go wrong with a grid. It always looks cute. Something to consider with layering stamps is you don't always have to use all of the layers. For this card, I'm just using that top outline layer. And I only want to use a little section of my card, but I don't really want to measure. So this is something I do often. I just use some lengths of low-tack tape and I put them right next to each other and then remove them until I get a space that is the right size. And then with that tape still in place, I'm going to pop it in my Misty. I'm going to treat it with some anti-static powder. I'm going to ink it up with clear embossing ink, and then I'm going to emboss it with clear powder. And then with this pixie tape that I'm using, I'm actually going to leave it in place while I heat set my embossing powder, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that with all tapes. Some might get too sticky with the added heat and then tear your paper later. Pixie tape is great. I've never had that problem, but maybe test it on something before you do it. If you do need to remove your tape before embossing, no big deal. Just remove it and then put it back in place before you move on to the next step, which is this ink blending over the embossed image. After I'm happy with the ink blending, I am going to go over the embossed image with a dry paper towel to take off any excess ink, make it bright white again, and then I'm just going to remove the tape and finish my card with an easy stamp sentiment. This is such a simple and easy card design, but it never disappoints. I'm always happy with how it turns out. Okay, one last little trick for you. Have you ever masked directly on your stamps? So I like to do this all the time. I think it's kind of lazy masking, but it's so effective. So for this drink, I only want the orange to be orange, not the drink. So I've just put a piece of tape across the glass part of the base stamp, and I've used a blending tool to add orange just to the orange slice. Then I can remove the tape and stamp it down onto my cardstock. And then I can repeat the process, but this time mask off the orange slice and do the rest of the drink. Okay, and I know I said that masking was the last thing, but I have one more thing to share. So for an easy background and a clean and simple card, a repeated stamp sentiment is really fun. And it's so easy to do in the Misty because after putting your stamp in there and inking it up and stamping, you can just move your cardstock down, whatever the amount is that you want to do to have in between the stamps, ink up your stamp again, and you've got perfectly lined up repeated sentiment. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and thank you so much for supporting Essentials by Ellen. You can find more information about these cards and these supplies on the Ellen Hudson blog. There'll be a link in the video description. Thanks again, and happy crafting!